right, welcome back to the Skillist podcast. I'm Brad Salon from the Roots School.
The Roots School, the one and only. I'm Matt Corradino from Caribbean Earth Skills, St. Croix.
Nice. There's actually several other random Roots schools. They don't do skills, but there's one in like Pakistan.
What do they do?
Emails. There's like a Pakistani like charter school that we get emails for, and then there's a Roots school that does like kids nature connection stuff.
Does Roots translate in Pakistani? Is that like a Pakistani word too?
My budget doesn't include taking out rival schools anymore, so.
What? Not anymore. No, not that I've eliminated my other competition in the Vermont area. Leaves and Branches tried to put up a fight, but they don't stand a chance without Roots. That was bad. I ran with it.
So today the topic is caretaking. What does that mean?
Forest to you? landscape management.
Nature connection.
What are you nature?
Insert buzzword from nature school.
Is that what you do with your buzzwords? Is insert them in nature schools?
Yes.
Is that I will give you credit. Your nature school does not include the words earth or nature or any of those words. What is it? Earth school, like, or the word skills, native. Yeah. Wild, native. Yeah. Yeah. That you're not your non-buzzword school name. Yeah. I just dove straight into the cheese ball with Caribbean Earth Skills. Earth skills.
Yeah.
What is not an Earth skill? This is a Mars skill.
Our whole field has an identity issue in terms of not having a decent name to represent itself.
Well, I mean, what do you call it? Survival skills, when that's kind of silly, because like farming is survival. Right?
Well, right, and people like that invokes like the image of like the survivalist in a bunker with lots of ammo and rations.
Yeah, I gotcha. And like, what are you surviving from? There's that whole angle.
Yes.
And then you call it primitive skills, and people get offended because it's primitive, and they think that you're insulting it. And so then you call it earth skills because that's acceptable.
Or ancient skills or ancestral skills.
Ancestral.
We just went with traditional so that we could do blacksmithing also.
Yeah, it helps. Well, thus you put in the word caretaking, right? Because it's not just like, we're not just talking about like managing landscapes for some specific economic outcome, right? Although there's an argument to be that that's exactly what you're doing anyway when you're caretaking the land, right?
Right.
So what does that mean? What does that even mean to you? What is that? What is that? What's the goal? What are you trying to do?
I mean, I first heard that term at the tracker school, so I'll give credit where it's due. And it was the concept, in my understanding, that if you're going to take from the landscape, you then become responsible for caretaking it, which means, leaving it better than you found it in some way, protecting the specific species that you're harvesting from by not over-harvesting, and or even increasing the fecundity or the richness of that species on the landscape. Also doing things like invasive management, although there's argument about what invasive really means or not. Mm-hmm. And some of them I think are pretty valid. And then, in my day-to-day life, having a piece of land that I own,
yep,
that I take care of, then it's a matter of, making it better in terms of my opinion of what better is, which means more biodiversity for plant, animal, and bird life, more biodiversity for the tree species, and then produces more food for my family and I, is a better teaching environment, so it has teaching materials. I put all those things in the category of caretaking, or advanced land relationship would be another way to put it.
Advanced land relationship. Yeah. This is how we robotically do it. The chainsaw hands cutting now.
Yeah, it's definitely. I feel like, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I do feel like in our modern society we're starting to come out of that, like, it's like a long time ago we had this idea that like land should be managed for economic, long run, like the best economic productivity, and then at some point once we as a culture started recognizing the value of wild landscapes, that then we kind of moved into this don't touch it kind of phase. And it seems like maybe culturally we're coming out of that don't touch it phase. Because you can't, leaving a landscape completely alone, sure, it's got value in that, like, you're not going to screw anything up, which people tend to do from time to time. But it's not realistic in the long run, considering the wholesale changes to the landscape that we cause by our culture. Like, you bring up like invasive species, and it's like there are certain species that I definitely like would consider invasive. Like in the desert Southwest, for instance, like the tamarisk, and how it just takes over entire areas. But then there's like lots of species that are considered invasive. Like, I'll just say, for instance, here or in a lot of tropical areas, there's the the Leucaena leucocephala, that is considered invasive because it kind of takes over, but it's actually a great stepping stone species towards a forest, because it allows enough sunlight through to seed, whatever you want to plant and like grow it into a forest. So yeah, and you'll go to areas where there's nothing but that tantan, but you can easily use that to manage towards a native forest or whatever type of forest you want to manage towards. So I think that invasive species label is kind of a tricky one. What does it mean? I only apply it to plants that like exclusively outcompete everything else. Like spreading bamboo in the States will go in patches where it just exclusively takes over, and it's like the only plant that you're going to find in areas where it's taken over, right? Except for maybe mature trees that were already there. But then you got to look at the whole landscape. So you're talking about managing a forest, for instance, for like a great diversity of species, and I would say that, like, I try to look at it more as, yes, diversity of species in each niche, but then I look at it as like, okay, what does the landscape have a lot of, right? There's tons of vine thicket here. So even though that's a valuable habitat for a lot of animals, like for instance, we don't see as many warblers here on the property itself once we started thinning out vines for the forest to be able to get mature. Like, at least lower down at the lower levels of the canopy, you don't really used to see a lot of warblers here on the property at this time of year. And now we don't see as many because we've removed the vines, and they love those viney thickets. But if you look at St. Croix overall, there's like tons of viney thicket. So it's like they're not hurting for that habitat. Where they are hurting is like, for a mature forest, like, mature actual forest, not woodland, but, like an enclosed canopy. And I think about this as like a survival skill, really, in the long run, because I always learned and taught these skills from the perspective of like, what if this was it? Like, you couldn't go back to buying food from the store. You couldn't go back to, getting your resources from far away. What would you do? And so when you're harvesting with an eye towards what you're leaving behind, you're going to leave behind a lot more of, hopefully, of what you're trying to harvest again in the future. So it's like understanding the landscape and understanding it enough so that you can tell what might come in the future. And that has a huge survival value.
Right. I mean, that's, I think, one of the key pieces, and if you look at even just the difficulty of survival, the idea that people who are living in survival weren't doing everything they could to make it easier is crazy. And so over a pretty short period of time on a land base, it becomes easy to recognize, well, wouldn't it be nice if there were more of this? And that thing seeds at this time of year. So when it's seeding, let's go shake those seed pods out and maybe actually carry them over to a place that looks like where they're growing now and get more of them to grow in this other spot. You know, that kind of thing, I think, is a pretty obvious survival technology. Aside from not just taking too much, it's also how can we increase the strength of that species set that we benefit from.
I think the tough part comes into like it's got to come back to your values, right? Because some people would make the argument that, like, let's say clear cutting all of the native forests in an area would help fire suppression, or it might help, you know, control of certain animal species that you would want to, you know, have reduced, or, you know, there's if you're basing it on a value, then that value's in the eye of the beholder. But it still seems kind of like pretty straightforward, and I think the reason why as humans we get into this problem is because we value money more than we value any other, like universally we value money. Obviously not everybody values money as like the highest, you know, standard of value, but generally speaking, universally in our modern American culture, the only like common denominator of value tends to be money. And so if that's your value, then it doesn't matter, right? You cut it all down. Then you get into the argument of like, all right, denuding the landscape, and now you don't have any for the future. So like, where is the balance there? But
right,
just in terms of like survival wise,
well, it's interesting though.
It becomes a lot more clear.
Well, and you get into a weird thing with the economics where most of the people denuding landscapes are from lower income situations where they have the job that they can get. They work that job. They're just trying to put food on the table for their family. If they had a way of making money that didn't involve destroying the landscapes that they probably have grown to love, then they probably wouldn't do that. You know, I've seen some stuff about shark fishermen who are eradicating shark populations to feed their families because they're feeding them with money that's, you know, they're selling the shark fins and they're feeding their families. When given a different job, such as even shark tourism, they move to that. They would rather not be doing the like wholesale slaughter of the sharks. They even understand the ecological value of sharks, but if they don't have another opportunity for feeding their family, most of the time people are going to choose feeding their family over, you know, a greater ecological purpose.
Well, I find it interesting that you say that because I think that all depends on like the income level and the economic stability or lack thereof of the region. Because you're talking about like shark fishermen in an economy where there's like less mobility there. Whereas, you know, in the States, for instance, like I've just mentioned logging, and that's not to say that I'm against logging. I'm just against most modern logging practices. Because then you get into that argument of like, okay, you could do something else potentially, right? You prefer to do this, but what is the way in which you do it, right? Maximizing that profit versus like a lower level of income, but at a sustained level. And like, you know, when you think of selective harvest, right? It's like a, you know, most people are okay with selective harvest, right? When you hear that versus clear cut logging, people are like, oh, selective harvest, that's fine. But if you've ever seen like a selectively cut forest before and after, it's the biggest trees with the highest economic value. And so, you know, if you were doing this on a selective basis for the ecosystem, you would be taking some of everything, right? You take a few of the larger trees in areas where there was a bunch of them, so you'd have sunlight reaching the forest floor. You'd take mostly mid-sized trees so that the other trees could get larger. You would be, you know, some of the damaged trees might come out, right? It will be selective, right? This area can benefit from this area can benefit from that. But, you know, it's again, we get back to that value of like, if I place it on a value scale, like we shouldn't touch this area because it's beautiful and amazing, and so we should leave all the trees there. Well, then that's somewhat It's believed to be arbitrary.
Well,
although I don't believe it's all that arbitrary.
But my point is that in most cases, your immediate survival needs are going to trump any sort of long-term ecological needs, and that, like, if you had to make it through a winter with your family, and it required you to kill all the grouse and porcupines in your area so that your kids didn't freeze to death and starve to death, you would probably make that trade, you know, so that you didn't have to watch your kids starve to death. Like I don't.
Well, maybe. What would you leave yourself
I 100% would kill every fucking porcupine I could find until there were none left in the state if it meant my kids surviving. You know,
But why would you do that though? Like, let's see, you're talking about this scenario, right?
Because
but
my personal feeling towards my children is greater than my love of porcupines. Like, I love porcupines.
What about moving?
I think they're incredible animals. But if it came down to it, I'm gonna choose my kids over the porcupine any day.
Well, what I'm saying is why would it ever come down to it?
Well, what I'm saying is that people are in a position commonly. It's just not as boiled down or straightforward. But people are commonly in a position in which they are in an economic situation in which they have to choose to denude their landscape or not have enough money to feed their families. And that a lot of the time, it's not the people who are doing the work to denude the landscape who are making all the money off of it. Those are the lower level jobs, and those people are being taken advantage of and have shit working conditions and poor wages. And that the people who are making all the money, you know, like in the case of logging, it's not the loggers that are making all the money. It's the people who own the land and the people who own the logging companies. And, you know, so I guess when it comes down to it, I think a lot of people make decisions based on what they have an immediate survival need for. And then if you take people beyond that to a point where they're not in a moment-to-moment survival situation, then they can start to think long-term. And so in terms of like my ability to teach people, I recognize that until somebody has their basic needs met, that a lot of the idea of caretaking is going to fall on deaf ears.
See, I don't know. I totally do not think I agree with that, because if you're talking about like a global, worldwide economic situation, when you talk about people who are willing to denude the landscape for their own personal survival needs, right? But if I'm in an actual survival situation, and I decide that, you know, eating this animal that's like easiest to catch, and I'm putting all of my resources on catching that one particular animal, right? And that's like where my entire focus is there's only going to be a limited supply of that animal until I'm finally like, oh shit, I can't eat any more of those because I've killed all of those in this area. And then, you know, then I move on, right? I don't believe that's a viable survival strategy, like in any sense. Like, yes, emergency situation.
Yeah, that's
sure,
what I'm saying. That's your only option for survival. Once you have the ability to choose, okay, I'm going to kill some of these, but I've started to kill a lot of them. Now I'm going to move on before they're all gone, or I'm going to switch species until they're all gone. Or even, hey, I've made a kill. Now this is going to allow me to have the energy to broaden my horizon or build a higher tech weapon or make more traps. That I agree with. But what I'm saying specifically is, like, you have to be out of that emergency, oh shit, I'm going to die or my kids are going to die situation before you can start to consider the long term.
I think this applies to both the personal emergency survival situation and the like, you know, larger worldwide. It's what is your skill base? If you're not very skilled and you're limited and you can only catch those porcupines because you're not skilled enough to catch anything else, that your skills suck and you should get better. You know what You like that? Like you know, okay. So I'll give an example. It's like pine bark, right? Nobody likes eating pine bark, but most people just eat it plain, right? Whereas if you take it, you grind it into flour, you roast it, and you eat it like sparingly, you know, not necessarily sparingly, but like, you know, in addition with every meal that you eat, right? That's like a huge resource of food. Or like, beech nuts. Let's say I've done survival trips with people where people weren't eating the beech nuts because they were so small and they were like, oh, this isn't worth it. But like you eat as much as you reasonably can, right? So those are just two examples, right? But like if you're unwilling to learn the skill base of how do I prepare this, how do I make this so that it could be part of my diet regularly, right? That's a lack in your skill set. And the same could be said for like you're talking about like a shark fishermen who feel economically pushed into that. Now we're getting into this whole like politics, economics, like global systematic ways of living, and it's like, yes, there are definitely people who don't have that many choices because the government's in power, because the people who push the levers of power don't allow for those people to have a more diversified outlook on life, or they don't have enough land to grow enough food, or everything's been denuded to such a point that there's only this one or two things left. Yes, but you see that's like short-sighted survival goals. That's how that all happened. Well, right? It started with a short-term survival goal, except for the dude who's making all the money.
Right. Well, and that's the thing I guess I wanted to draw the line to is that it's easy when you are a landowner in Vermont to have high aspirations for, building the landscape so that it fits you better. But it is a position that not a lot of people are in. And I just wanted to point to the fact of that before we get into, all the different things about caretaking and how beautiful it is and what an awesome relationship you can have with a landscape, or even wax poetic about native groups who did thousands of years of caretaking so that their landscapes were incredibly productive and they had an easier time surviving on the landscape because of that. That to just say like, it's not wave a wand and it's not easy in every situation, and that you have to have your basics covered before you can start to think long term. Do I think it makes more sense? Yes. And do I wish society at large valued this type of thinking? Absolutely. And I think that's a big part of why you and I do these skills, is it's a way of personally staying connected to the landscape and then also helping to foster other people's connections.
I don't disagree with what you're saying about as far as like you need to have that you have to have those
You have to have the sacred order covered.
right. You need that shelter, water, fire, food all covered. I just saying I don't think people realize how much power they have to affect that, right? Like
that is true, and that's empowering.
This is me personally. I'm
incredible.
Like, I'm personally like an advocate of organic food, not because it might have better nutrients, but because there's just less pesticides being used overall, and I value that. If everybody did that because that's what they valued, then it wouldn't be as expensive, right? Because it wouldn't be this niche model. Like, things could be done totally different if people cared or valued things in a different way. And, like, for instance, like those shark fishermen, why aren't they eating the rest of the shark? Like, okay, there's not space on the boat to take a shark back for everybody. I get that. But, like, some of those people might be in a position to do that, right? Like, I don't think people always, and again, I'm sure people will punch holes in that in that statement right there. But like, I don't think we recognize how much choice there is that we exercise on a daily basis, right? And so even somebody who's like living in a city, right, they're not going to be like hands-on doing much caretaking on the landscape, but the choices of what they're purchasing, those things make a huge freaking difference, right? Like that makes all the difference in those denuded landscapes. That's usually denuded because somebody wanted to make a whole ton of money by denuding it, and somebody bought that, right? Some random dude bought that board at Home Depot instead of knowing how to mill the logs that were like right outside of his house. Oh, cut that tree down because it might fall on my house. Reasonable enough. Like, if you milled that thing, then when you added your addition, you could save a couple bucks and not be part of that other larger system. I look at this as like an everyday thing more than people realize. But that's a different thing than what I guess we were originally talking about, is like hands-on. What do I do in this area as I'm practicing my survival skills?
Yeah.
Like there's kind of two arguments there.
Well, right. There is a connection. I think we can get back to, how do we make our interactions with the landscape so that we leave it better than we found it. And one of the things you said in the beginning was there's this concept of leave no trace, or, don't touch the landscape. And it was interesting. When I first started teaching skills, it was at a wilderness school that was outdoor ed, right? And so this is older school outdoor ed where it's like high and low ropes courses. Somebody sawing something?
Somebody's working on a bow.
Nice.
In the corner. Yeah, I like it. It's good
Atmospheric sound.
Yeah. So, it was very 80s style, 90s style outdoor education. And the whole thing was basically you should only affect the campsite. And the campsites are barren, like hard rock. And the fire pits have huge rocks around them and a giant pile of ash of black coal because everyone's dumped water on them to put the fires out. And there was no knowledge of the landscape. Instructors didn't even know poison ivy. They didn't know how to start a fire off the landscape. And it was, they didn't know how to deal with bugs. They didn't.
Sounds like a great time.
Yeah, it was insane.
Who certified those instructors?
And people looked at me like I was crazy when I taught people to get firewood from dead standing trees. They were like, oh, you can't have them do that. And I was like, what? That's where the dry wood is. We're in a wet thicket. Like, New England is a wet thicket. We need to get dry firewood. And they were like, no, you can't have them break it out of the tree. And I'm like, but it's dead. And they're like, no, they'll break live branches. And I'm like, we can't teach people to tell the difference between a living branch and a dead one, but we're outdoor educators or wilderness instructors. So that shit used to drive me crazy. And
you know what's even crazier about that is that, like, you would, in a lot of places in a wet thicket type area, you would be better off cutting a live tree from a thick area and letting it dry out than you would like even breaking off small branches. Of course, that night you'll have a smoky, crappy fire. But imagine saying that to one of those guys. Well, if we cut a couple of these ones here, we'll give more room to these other trees.
Right.
That's like full on freak out. You can't cut the living tree down. No.
Right. And so I spent a long time fighting against that mentality, and it has been nice to see, especially as more schools that teach, in the vein of things that we teach have arisen. There's more this concept of like, how do I have a relationship with the landscape that involves interaction? And then I think what we're getting to with caretaking is that if I play my cards right, that interaction can not just have no impact on the landscape, it can have a positive impact on the landscape. And that's been really interesting. And I've succeeded and failed at that. Like, I haven't always been successful in that. And I also have realized over the years that, especially where I live, disturbance is not a bad thing.
Yeah, not always.
Like where I live, the woods are very homogeneous and it's a lot of boreal or mixed boreal forest. And there's very little food sources. And if you cut open an area, all of a sudden sunlight is getting to the ground and animals are flocking to that place to get food. And it creates multiple stories of aerial habitat, and you increase the biodiversity of your bird species. So it's been instructive to me over the years to go from the concept of don't touch it to actually done right and with a level head, big disturbances can be long-term beneficial to a landscape.
Yeah, if they're strategic and like in balance, right? Not disturb at all, but in pockets. And and I think that definitely attitudes have changed on this, but the whole thing of leave no trace is absolutely ridiculous. It's impossible to leave no trace, right? Even if it's just footprints. But I mean, you go to an area that is hiked on all the time, and that area around the trail is generally pretty freaking dogged. Right? So I see it as impossible to leave no trace. Sure, like little trace. Yeah, but like better to leave a positive impact on the landscape than no impact on the landscape.
Well, right. And so,
But then this all comes back to education. Like,
That's
what
the
does
key.
that mean to have an impact on the landscape? Like, a lot of people don't even, don't know an oak tree from a maple tree, and if you don't know what the differences in the trees are, like, you're not in a very good position to do any improvement on the land. Which is crazy to think of how many people are in decision-making positions who don't know an oak from a maple.
well, that's the thing is, I think the analogy that I found that works best for people with this is friendship, and that people hear nature connection, and it makes, for me, it's such a tired, beat-up term that I hate to even say
Yeah.
it, but what it really
You're never
means,
disconnected.
What it really means is relationship. And when I say I have a relationship to the land, I mean it in the way that I have a relationship to my friends or my family or my kids, in which I understand their expressions. I understand just by looking at their posture what their mood is or their set of emotions. I understand their history. I understand their hopes and aspirations. And I have a real relationship with them in which a give and take is possible. And if I have a hands-off relationship with my friends, I'm not doing them any service. If I see that they're upset or they lost a loved one and I don't want to have an impact so I don't say anything, that's not positive, right? And then I also know, oh man, this dude just needs space right now to like go chill, or I just need to go do something that's not related to the problem that they're having and help get their mind off it. Like, you learn how to have a relationship with people and what's best for them by being aware and spending time with them. And the same thing is true of a landscape. If you have to go into a landscape and take one look at it and then make decisions about how to affect it in big ways, you're never going to hit 100% in terms of your ability to impact it positively. But if you have a many-year relationship with a piece of land and you've seen it through all the seasons and you've seen it through extremes and you've gotten to know it, then the impact that you have is easier to judge, and you can start to make decisions on behalf of that landscape that are much more likely to have long-term positive impacts. And that's the key, is that relationship.
I think that people are afraid to have any negative effect, and so they're more willing to just have no effect at all. And so that's why I always would encourage people to start with, obvious non-native invasive type plants that take over in areas, which are usually pretty easy to identify, or whatever plant. And because we're mostly talking about plant species, but we could definitely be talking about animal species. I mean, that's what guides my hunting here. There's tons of birds on a survival trip. We could eat a lot of birds. We never touch the birds because they're all native species. When we have tons of we used to have mongoose, goats, and iguanas, and deer and other animals that are, not originally from here. Doesn't mean I'm trying to eliminate them. I mean, the goats from certain areas, yes, trying to eliminate them because of the amount of damage they do. But anyway, you start with those things that either to be non-native, or somehow damaging to the overall balance of the landscape. And you start with those, but you start somewhere and you manage it in a way okay, because I know the area, I know all right, we should get rid of all these goats here. But if I didn't know that area, I might not kill them all, right? But so you start with those things and then you watch the effect, right? And then you give it time to actually see what happens instead of just going blindly ahead with that same tactic over and over and over again. And so another thing is reading history and understanding historical accounts of what the landscape was like previously, because not every native group had what we would consider a balanced relationship with the land. Some native groups were over harvesting in our way of looking at things, changing the landscape to something that other than what it might have been originally. But at least it gives you some sort of starting point for what things were like before European plants and animals were introduced en masse. And at least it gives you some sort of starting point or something to aim towards. And I mean, obviously, you find that most places that aren't a desert were full of forest, like pretty much. But how managed was that forest? I mean, fire was regularly used.
Yeah.
Regularly. Whole entire landscapes were set ablaze on purpose.
Right. I don't think the idea that because somebody has different genetics, they're more or less prone to denuding a landscape. I think that there are cultures.
Oh, I didn't mean genetics. I just meant culturally.
Right. And even culturally, like, there's a point at which, with changing environments and things that are outside of human control, or even just a wrong turn in terms of the cultural direction, it's really easy to go too far. Or hunter-gatherer groups that were really simple in terms of their cultural development would definitely go to an area, hunt there until there were no more of whatever they were hunting a lot of, or it had gotten really hard to hunt there, and then move along. But they had huge amounts of area with low population density, and that was what worked. So I think people move into
all
what
that's
works.
Based off of all that's also based off of like understanding, though, right? And so the animals also had a huge amount of area to move to. So maybe they weren't actually killing everything there. Maybe they're just scaring all the animals away. Right. You can't draw any conclusion. You can't say that those people were over harvesting. You can't say that they were like in perfect balance. You can't really say either way because it's a completely different system, right? Like, yes, people, did. Of course, people over-harvested, they under-harvested, they did it just right, and there was a mix of all of that going on at all times. But it's like, who are we to judge? We can't say that because we're judging it from our modern, viewpoint of managing a landscape. Right.
I agree with that. And yeah, I think in terms of what I found works here, I think a really good point is that people do have to get their hands in and start cutting things down and start harvesting from the landscape. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about the skills is that if you really want to do them and you don't want to buy materials, which is kind of, you
pretty
have
lame.
to do it sometimes, but it can be pretty lame. Right? I mean, I buy bow staves from out of state because I'm addicted to how good Osage is. But
well, you're also not realistic. Well, I mean, I guess if you have hickory trees, you can cut down, or oak. What the hell's wrong with you? Cut down an oak tree every now and again, brah.
I mean, we don't really have that many oaks, and the oaks are one that I plant more oak than any other tree because
that's true.
Our beech trees have the fungus, and so they don't really produce nuts anymore. We've got a bunch of nutless beeches.
Take that one wherever you want to.
Yeah.
I'm in the forest of nutless beeches. I gotta get out of here.
And so, but
forest.
black locust grows fine here, and we planted a bunch of that so we could cut it down for bows. And honestly, sugar maple makes a good bow.
Yeah, right.
But it doesn't make an Osage bow. But outside of Osage,
I need you to cut down that Osage forest. What's funny is my brother, every year I go to visit him where he's at right now, his place he moved to. He's got like 5 really nice Osage trees, but he's got horses. And then you come out of the horse pasture and it was like an ash forest, and it's so brutal in there. It's like, even from a distance, I look at at least that forest that's kind of behind his house, and it's just like freaking the decimation of life in there with the ash borers, and like, it's just bad. So many dead trees, and then like the bittersweet vine that's just taking over. It's crazy. It's so like defeating to see that landscape. And I'm always of the mindset of like, okay, what can I do? And it's like, I could go in and I could take out that bittersweet, but then like usually his horses will follow me and then eat up, everything that grows in its path. It's like, it's a hard situation. And I see these Osage trees, and he's always like, dude, you can cut an Osage tree down. No problems. But I just don't have the heart to do it because I'm just like, oh, these are nice trees that the horses don't eat. And maybe I'll cut one down because is that better than buying them from somebody else? But right. I don't know.
So anyway,
tough
but
decisions.
Doing the skills, as long as you're not buying your materials, gets you out on the landscape, taking things from it. And then if you go back year after year, you witness the impacts of your harvesting, and you see, if you harvest willow correctly, you can actually make it better. You know, you can, especially for harvesting more willow in the future. And if you caretake a landscape as you harvest it, then you really can make it better, you know?
Well, that's paying close attention. Right. And again, there's got to be an education level. Oh, look, that's a maple sapling. Oh, that's a nutless beech sapling right there. You know, like recognizing those things and then fostering their growth, like helping to improve it.
Right. Or
if I'm going and I'm harvesting from an area.
When I need hardwood for firewood, I go cut beech on purpose and then I plant oaks there. Right?
Because you're trying to, so a lot of people, I think still people might have problems with that whole idea of like, why do you get to decide? And it's like, whatever we decide is having an effect.
Because I'm man and I have dominion over nature.
Dominion over you. You little nature over there.
I am man. No, but I mean,
I'm cutting all these silvery-skinned, nutless beeches down.
But it's because of humans
shaggy-barked oak.
And globalization that those trees have that disease. And so I'm like, okay, we've lost a nut-producing tree. I'm going to try and replace it with another nut-producing tree. And these beeches are all sick, and they're going to die and snap off anyway. So I may as well get my firewood there, and then... You know, we go down to where my folks live in Mass and we collect a shitload of acorns every year. And then half of them we process into flour and half of them we drive around in the Ranger and just throw them into the woods. And
so that they can be eaten by squirrels.
Right. And so
other starving
the squirrels
animals
are
that have nothing but balsam fir bark to eat. And they're like, oh my God!
And then,
it's a nut! Ah!
Yeah. And then, you know, half of them grow. And I see all along our trails tons of little tiny, you know, oak saplings. And, you know, it's of value to the landscape. And it's probably going to be long beyond when I'm here that there's really a lot more oaks because of that. But I'd rather that than not do anything about it.
This gets into like the saddest part of all this is I used to I still do spend a lot of time like doing my caretaking projects, like, oh, I'm going to thin out this area over here because it's got too many vines or whatever it is. And then you're just like hoping that the work that you've done is actually of value. I have a friend who, he started using this forest. It was a friend of his family owned this property that they had clear cut, you know, however many years back, 15 years before he started using that land. And it was just like 20 foot tall pine tree thicket everywhere you went. And he just like kind of took it on as a project. And in the like 10 to 15 years that he was working on that landscape, it was unbelievable, the change in the landscape. Like how quickly he was able to get those trees to, like, you know, they were 15 feet tall in the, you know, 15 or 20 years before he got there. And in the next 10 years, they quadrupled in size, just because of the forest. So the tree work he did, the soil amendments that he did, like, and then he was kind of moving into like mechanized. He did so much by hand for the first number of years. And then he had it mechanically thinned by loggers. He went in and personally marked the trees down, and they went in and selectively cut in places. And it was unbelievable, the change in that landscape, like night and day. I mean, there was like a company that was contracted to remove solid wastes from Washington, D.C. area, and it was going to happen in these counties that, you know, one of these counties, he was in Fluvanna County in Virginia, and he applied for it on that land, which was, you know, of course those companies jumped at it because people don't want solid wastes, and he had them apply it. And like a year later, it was unbelievable what it did for the soil. So he did all these things like on this large scale in a very short amount of time. And then the family turned around and started logging it. And he was just like clear cut logging it. And he was like, I am so done with this project right here. And it's heartbreaking, but also amazing how quickly he turned that around. Well, right. And started off on hand, but then moved into like modern, you know, like large scale. I mean, serious change. It was freaking amazing to see what could happen in that short an amount of time.
That is one thing I was actually going to point out with caretaking is that it can be so fucking heartbreaking.
You know, man.
I mean, you had
I did
the
that.
hurricane.
Oh yeah. Well, you know what? Honestly, all the areas that are healthiest in here are the places that I did the most caretaking, and all the areas that were most hard hit were the places that received the least amount of caretaking. The hardest hit areas were the areas that had never had vines cleared, and that had less diversity of tree species and mostly just gnips all around. But you know what's cool about here is I did caretaking every year before, because we came down every year for 6 years before we bought, and I was just doing caretaking on the landscape for the sake of doing it. And I remember taking this kid that I'd hang out with, I taught him how to surf, and I'd take him on these like surf trips down into this wild area here, Onally Bay, and we were doing caretaking on the land, and I was telling him all this other stuff I did, and he's like, why are you doing that? And I said, oh, because, to improve it for the future. And he's like, yeah, but that's not your land, so they could just cut it down at any point. And then I was like, oh, damn, that's true. And then we ended up buying it here. And so, it's like a lot of that was thankfully preserved. But I still think it's better to do that than not to do that, because you're going to have an impact. So you might as well have the best impact you can possibly have. If Joe Schmo comes along afterwards and makes a bunch of money off of the forest work you did, then it really sucked for him. They made so much more money because of him. But he was like not going to continue to manage their forest, because he's like, I'm not doing it for you to make a bunch of money off of this.
Right.
I'm doing it for the sake of the forest. Crazy too, because he would have made them money continuously into the future. He wasn't anti-logging, right? He was trying to build something that could be sustainably harvested into the future, like endlessly into the future. So, and it's just, I think, it's an important thing to think about too, is that if you're doing this correctly, you're creating a landscape that you could endlessly harvest from, like truly sustainable in that way. Which, shoot, that's a pretty darn good survival scenario right there, like creating that.
Well, right, that is the ideal, is, you hunt the deer population to make a stronger deer population so that you have easy deer hunting. You grow lots of food for the squirrels so that it's easy to go out and shoot a squirrel. And it means there's lots of squirrels, which is great for the squirrels. And the squirrels then plant more trees because they forget all the things that they've buried, and that you participate in increasing the survival ability of the landscape. But it is hard to get there, and it does take a long time. I think, if anything,
it's hard but easy.
Well, right, and I think it goes back to what we were talking about with the kids and kids programs. Like, this is an amazing thing to include in kids programs. That when you
totally, they love it,
right? And when you're cutting down, it's really cool too. We're lucky enough to work with kids year after year after year, so you can go harvest bow staves with a group of kids and cut over an area and say, hey, we're going to take a bunch of these saplings out of here. We can make bows out of them, and it's going to make this landscape better for these reasons. And then you go back 5 years later and you say, hey, remember when we cut all these yellow birches out of here to open it up, and we planted these other trees? Well, look, let's cut them down. Here's the results of that. Right.
I would say we work with the same kids year after year, but I keep scaring them away by being too mean. I end up with 1/3 the amount of kids in my teenager program than we have in the little kids, because I drive too hard of a line, too hardcore.
I think it's hard, actually, and we didn't talk about this, is off topic, but I think it's hard to bring kids from skills as a kid into it as a teenager and not have it seem like a thing they did when they were kids.
Yeah, it's definitely hard. Only the really passionate ones end up staying with it.
Sure.
And a lot of times they don't even know they're passionate about it, right? They don't even realize how much they enjoy it.
Right.
And I'm glad you brought up like relationship with the land, because it really, all it comes down to is exactly that. Like, what type of relationship do we have from the land? Do we have a type of relationship where we're just going to take and take and take and take and take until like there's nothing there to be had from that relationship, except for like the pain of what you did to that other entity, right? Which is, I think, like culturally where a lot of us are at. It's like, oh, don't touch it, because think about all the years where we absolutely wrecked this. You know what I mean? Well, no, you have to go in and actually like put your hands on, right? You have to you have to be involved in that relationship, which really, it's like, it can be as simple, for people who are more disconnected, is like, if you could produce just the smallest amount more food for yourself, right? That's a more positive relationship with the land. A lot of times, I recently scared a teenager away from my teenager programs. We had killed this iguana, and we were gutting it and skinning it to eat it, and she was like off in the corner, and I didn't really care that she was off in the corner, but I heard her make a comment about how bad we were. Like, we were bad people because we killed this animal, and look what we did to kill this animal. And obviously I didn't have this conversation in the right way, but but I was saying to her, well, do you eat meat? And she was like, well, yeah, I do. And I was like, well, you're responsible for that. And she was like, no, I don't kill the cows. I don't, it's not my responsibility. I just bought it at the store. And I was like, well, no, you are responsible. If you buy it, you're responsible, right? Yeah, a portion of it, but, so in your whole lifetime, you're responsible for what, 50 cows, 60 cows? But like, you didn't kill them, but you're still responsible for that.
Right.
And we don't want to believe that we're responsible for that. And that goes for like, like, how much do we drive? Could we drive a little bit less? Because that, like, remember during the BP oil crisis, the BP Horizon spill, some students at a class were asking me like, oh, what's it up to? And I was like, oh, it's such and such barrels. I looked at it today and I was like, but that's our spill. This girl got so angry at me. That's not my spill. That's BP's spill. Blah, 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 blah. And I was like, what, did you drive here? And she was like angry. She did admit that she had driven to the class. And it turns out she works for Greenpeace. So I get it. My friend was like, well, you shouldn't argue with her. She's not going to listen. She works for Greenpeace, man. Like, and I'm like, that's great. I'm so glad she does that. But at the same time, she drove. Like, what are you going to do? Right? You accept responsibility for the relationship that you have with the land, because everybody has a relationship with it. We're just removed,
Yeah.
Somebody else does the talking for us.
I think that,
like,
yeah, man. I mean, I have stories like that too, where my aunt, who once at a dinner, Thanksgiving dinner, had like turkey and ham on her plate, told me that hunting was disgusting. And I was just like, yo, you literally have two separate dead animals on your plate right now.
Exactly.
But
exactly.
People do think if I'm not personally responsible for that it doesn't count towards my personal, impact. But that's obviously not true. And I think
you're just making a choice to ignore it.
And I mean, we didn't set the scene, but then we choose how to act within the scene. And you have to make concessions. I mean, we're recording this on phones that are made with rare earth minerals,
that wrecked it up.
We're using tons of electricity, and not all the sources of electricity are great. And
it's terrible.
It is what it is. I think, though,
but if we do what we can,
we do, and
within
then
those constructs,
and having some sort of awareness and relationship of it, as opposed to just being like, well, fuck it, I'm a human, I take. And I mean, there's also a part of me, when I was thinking about this whole conversation about caretaking, there's a really cynical part of me that can look at human beings as bugs and say, if I were an alien in space, like observing from our cloaking device what humans were doing, I'd be like, weird. These intelligent apes dig up things, change them, and put them in a pile in another place and bury them. That's like what humans are fucking doing. And they're really serious about it, and on the way, maybe they make a song or something. But in general, we dig shit up out of the ground, we turn it into a product, it becomes obsolete, we throw it away, and like, that's what the human race is doing right now.
Yeah, but we only do that because our value is money, right? If our value was actual, like, and it used to be a different value. It was really recent in human history that people made nice stuff. And now we purposely make junk so that other people will buy junk so that they have to keep buying junk, right? But in this, again, it's like the power of the consumer. How much junk do you buy? Do you need any of that junk? Right? You probably don't need 90% of, I know I don't need like so much of what I have, but when I do buy something, I try to make it last as long as possible. And I spend the money on the thing that lasts longer on purpose. And I try to make it last longer as long as I can make it last. Right. And that's all caretaking. I mean, it's not as exciting as going out to an area. Like I love it. I could do it all day. I could go to areas like, I do a lot of divining is like stage one for me, going into an area and like removing all the vines. The native ones I try to go like with less heavy of a hand, but I'll usually cut them out, and then the non-native ones I uproot them, and then I move from removing all the vines to then thinning out the trees that are the most represented and replacing them with native trees that are less represented, or sometimes fruit trees that I'm going to be using for food. And then eventually it moves to like there's really nowhere on the property that's ready for this yet, but at some point we'll move to the point where we're like cutting down large mature trees for wood. Like there's places where I'm actually going to be doing that pretty soon, is cutting down some large trees to make space for new trees in those areas where there's already some trees. I'm not like, removing the forest. I'm just like strategically removing, and I'll be using all that lumber for building materials. And I love that. It's such a, like, I could just spend all my time doing that.
Right.
If I was able to live off of it, which eventually we'll get there. I think we're if I had to guess, I'd say we're at about 40% of our calories either come from the land or come from our land specifically, or from animals that I hunt. And I try to keep the fishing to a minimum, except for lionfish. I'll kill every one of them little fuckers. But but yeah, I try to do that, and but to me that's like exciting. I love that, and the strategizing. But it took me, 6 or 7 years to have a good system, because before I was over thinning certain things and not thinning enough of the vines, because I was like, oh well, vines are a natural part of the ecosystem here, and they are, but you have to have a mature forest to withstand the weight of the vines. Like it's not going to get to mature forest otherwise. It's going to get certain height and then get pulled over, and then grow up to a certain height and then pulled over and become this massive thicket. So yeah, no, I love that hands-on part of it, but it doesn't have to be the hands-on. If you don't have that means, it's like pay attention to everything you buy, and if you care, then you make a change in what you're buying, but don't like make yourself too hardened, because you'll just be depressed by it.
Right.
Well,
right, and at least like if you have to participate. I don't really believe that a human being who runs off into the woods when I was 18, I was like, oh, the solution to this is that I run off into the woods and live simply and have no impact. But that's unrealistic in that, one, if everyone chose to do that, everything would be cut down.
Most of those people would die.
Right,
I say you let them move into the woods, brah.
Right.
The overpopulation problem.
But right, if the trucks stopped running and every dude who owns a gun in Vermont went out to shoot a deer, there'd be no deer left in a week.
Or there'd be a lot of spent ammunition laying in the woods.
There'd be very few deer left.
There'd be very few deer left.
Right.
But there'd probably be some starving dudes.
Or New England has trees because we're rich enough to buy our trees from other places. Like when we were doing agriculture and it was all ranching of, sheep, Vermont had no trees. And then it became cheaper to buy sheep from New Zealand and get wool from New Zealand. And then we stopped using wool largely. And we started importing trees to build with. And then you were allowed to, basically not allowed, but it made sense to grow forests. And there was this whole idea of like timber production. But the long and the short of it is, if New England economically at large weren't rich enough to buy its trees and wood and energy and oil from other places, if we didn't heat our houses predominantly with propane and fossil fuels, then we wouldn't have trees. It would all be cut down and burned. So
well, I think it depends on how you do it. If you look at our technology, if we can freaking send anything to Mars, we could figure out a way to have like robust ecosystems and enough food on the table for everybody. I believe it.
Right. But my point was that like running off into the woods to live as an individual, I don't think
that's not the solution.
I don't think that solves any of the problems as much as it sounded cool when I was 18. And so then if you're going to be in the modern world and you're going to be participating, you have to accept some concessions. And so doing as little harm as possible, like you're talking about, using things that are less disposable, And being aware of those sorts of things makes a ton of sense. And then, the other point I think is valid is don't drive yourself crazy with it. Like, you don't want to be so strict or harsh about it that it becomes all-consuming. And then I think the final thing is, something you and I tend to err towards is, how can I make an impact that's larger than myself? And for me, one of the reasons I started the school was I found that browbeating people and getting on a soapbox and yelling at them about the destruction of the environment didn't do anything.
Yeah, that's usually what drives those kids away.
And I lost a lot of friends.
Or the time when I suggested that all of the cats be shot that are at Altoona Lagoon. That's where everybody drops the cats off. And there's there's so many hundreds of cats, and there's these save the cats, people who started cat shelters. And I just was on this soapbox talking about going and killing all the cats. They're like, oh, you can't kill the cats. I'm like, it's much more efficient. It's much more efficient than spaying them and letting them loose.
Right.
Because then you don't know which ones are spayed. You got to just kill them all. Think of all the doo-doo that we're swimming in because of those hundreds of cats.
Yeah.
Kill the cats. That's my campaign. People don't like that. Why is that, Brad?
The birders
Why don't people want to kill the cats?
The birders get it.
The birders are all about it.
Yeah.
And there was this, I went to this class at my wife's college I sat in one day, and the guy was a birder who was teaching the class. It was an ornithology class, and he was talking about how at this time the gull population was huge and the tern population was very small, and so there were these islands off the coast of Maine where they were trying to reduce the gull population and increase the tern population of nesting birds on this island. And you should have seen the looks of horror on half of the students' faces when he talked about how they put bird poison in butter and spread the butter on bread, and then we're just passing out poisoned bread and butter to the seagulls. It's yeah, well, I guess some people didn't like that, but now it's all terns on that island and there's no room for the gulls anymore. So he was successful. It's just poison the gulls, shoot
one massacre, and we've reachieved balance.
Thank you, killing. You helped so many problems.
But I mean, it does go to a point at which you have to recognize, one, humans have had such a huge impact already that it could take some extremes to right the ship.
Oh, yeah.
And then two, the impact that I was talking about in terms of, it's my belief that people don't really incorporate things that are much beyond their own actual life. And so if you can teach somebody to have an actual first-hand relationship with a land base, that they're much more likely to give a shit about that land base and about protecting that land base, as opposed to a theoretical land base that they're supposed to protect because of these theoretical lofty ideas.
Well, the thing is that it's not even theoretical. We have an effect on the land base. It's just so far flung, and it's in these little pieces that we don't see it. And to me, it's you teach the person to connect with the land base and care for that particular land base. And when they do that and they build that relationship, then they're more likely to pay attention to, oh, wait, what is this product that I purchased doing on the other side of the world where it's being produced at, right? And if you can't show that, if you can't build that relationship right in somebody's face where they see it every day, they're not likely to care as much, Well,
right, and
you have to see that.
That's why I think killing your own food, it's a shame with that girl that in killing that iguana, it's a shame that she wasn't able to see, okay, I now understand, you don't understand death really until you see it. You can be oh, we're not supposed to kill and killing is bad, and have all these feelings that somebody else put in your head about it, but until you see the light go
meanwhile eating steak.
Right. Well, and until you see the light go out of an animal's eyes, you don't even understand the cost of that steak. But once you've seen the death firsthand, you're okay, when I eat meat, I have to take...
This is what happens.
Right, exactly. And even a fucking chicken. You can see the beauty in a chicken's eye, and
Except for when it's calling at 4:30 in the morning.
Then you throttle that.
There's nothing but menace in that little chicken eye.
It's just
you got dead today.
Me outside, half naked, with like a sling with an unripe mango, trying to kill chickens in your yard.
No. I'm luring it in with food.
No, that's me.
I'm luring it in with
me
food.
when visiting.
Oh, you?
And being like, I've been sleeping in a darkened winter
trying to
cave.
Kill my chicken at night. Why don't you just poison that thing? It'd be much faster. Don't poison my chickens.
I'll
kill them. That's fine. I'll kill them.
But yeah, so I think that relationship with firsthand of killing things, whether it's a tree or, cutting down a beautiful tree can have its own impact. But I think getting those firsthand relationships, being personally responsible for the killing, for the taking, for the impact, gives you a greater sense of the impacts that you cause outside of your own two hands.
I still think it helps to have that groundwork of respect for what it is that you're killing.
Obviously.
Because, but I think you learn that. But I mean, some people are raised ignorantly, purposely ignorant, right? Not ignorant like they don't know. Ignorant like ignore that, right?
Right.
It's a bad feeling. Ignore that. Don't, that's a different kind of ignorance. So there has to be some kind of groundwork of building values. But yes, you do need to experience it to understand it. That's for sure. Especially in our culture, when it comes to dying, killing, anything, it's it can be pretty tough. To kind of break through that shell of killing is bad. Can't kill anything, right? Can't cut that down, right? That should stay up there. Can't kill that animal, right? But meanwhile, how many animals are you responsible for the killing of by the field full of corn that used to be a forest that was full of animals? How many animals are killed in that field every time it's harvested?
Right.
We don't, we need to experience that to respect it. So.
Indeed. Well, we got to respect your time.
What do you think?
You got to roll.
Yeah, I got stuff to do. I got people to bring around. I was keeping it simple. You don't like that. Big stick, right? Big stick, crushed skulls. But, people don't spend enough time with these big stick, crushed skulls. Gotta spend time throwing these suckers. Yeah. Everybody talks about throwing stick and then doesn't practice it. I think we were talking about this however many, I don't know what else we were talking about, but we kind of brought it up as people practice with these rough, crude weapons, and you say throwing stick. It's like the original weapon. You pick it up and you throw the stick, and you think you can get away with not throwing it, but you got to throw this sucker once a week at least, and close by, right? 5 feet, 6 feet, right? Something close. Smash it and be prepared to run up afterwards and continue to club it on the head because you probably hit it in the leg.
Yeah. Yeah, we teach our survival students to carry 2. Tuck one in your belt.
What I like to do is I like to have a bottle, an empty plastic bottle, and throw it, and then hit the bottle or not, and wherever the stick and bottle lands, that's where I throw from. So I end up throwing from real close by, and I end up throwing from real far away. It's just a fun way to practice, and then you get that instant feedback of smashing the bottle really good or hitting it flies way far away. It's fun to practice with these things.
Yeah.
You don't like that?
I don't. So I decided to show off my advanced throwing stick. This is a non-returning boomerang. I think what's so cool about these is that people figured out the airfoil, that it takes longer for the air to go over the top surface than the bottom surface and creates lift. These are best made out of super dense wood, and
I don't see a single dent on that thing.
Dent? Look at this. I chipped it.
Oh dang. All right, I stand corrected. Did you throw it at an animal?
I have, but that's not what I chipped it on.
No.
I chipped it in a field demoing it for kids. Kids love seeing this shit fly. Whenever I have stupid school demos, I throw these.
You pull that out and they're like, oh my god, that guy's actually cool despite that goofy looking scarf he's got on.
I can't wait to choke you with this scarf.
Stove, bro. You're not bringing it. It's too warm. You choke me with a
I told
pair
you
of
I'm
board
gonna wear it as a
shorts,
sarong.
Brad. That's right. Just that.
So that camp is just ours.
Oh,
Scare
man.
away everybody.
Well, thanks for watching, everybody. If there's anything you want to have us argue about or talk about or make stupid jokey comments about, please let us know. Like and subscribe. Hit the button. Whatever that means. And,
I haven't even added buttons. Hopefully by this point,
What is wrong with you?
I will be adding
oh my
buttons.
God, I'm just pointing to nothing.
I got kids,
Link in the
bro.
description.
I ain't got time for this shit.
Just
You're
link
just
in the
pointing at
description.
nothing.
No, I'm pointing at the link in the description now that I know. All right.
Till next time.
All right, everybody. This is over. It's over.
Goodbye.
Peace.